William Carr, Pawns in the Game, ch. 9. Guy Carr Pawns in the Game. Chapter 9. Political Intrigue, 1914-1919. The way international intrigue was used to depose the Right Honourable H.H. Asquith when he was Prime Minister of Great Britain in 1916 was explained to me by a man who was extremely well informed. I met him while serving as King's Messenger in 1917. We were in my room, in a hotel when, during the course of conversation, I mentioned that I strongly suspected that a comparatively small group of extremely wealthy men used the power their wealth could buy to influence national and international affairs, to further their own secret plans and ambitions. My companion replied, "If you talk about such things it is unlikely that you will live long enough to realize how right you are." He then told me how Mr. Asquith had been deposed in December 1916, and Mr. David Lloyd George, Winston Churchill, and the R.T. Hun. Arthur James Balfour were placed in power in England. The story he told me had a remarkable similarity to the plot used by the secret powers who directed the campaign of l'infamie immediately prior to the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789. It will be recalled a letter was used to lure Cardinal Prince de Rohan to the Palais Royal where he was involved with a prostitute disguised as Marie Antoinette. The alleged modern method is as follows. Shortly after the outbreak of the war in August 1914, a small group of wealthy men authorized an agent to turn an old, but very spacious mansion, into a fabulous private club. Those who made it possible to finance such a costly undertaking insisted that their identity remain secret. They explained that they simply wished to show their deep appreciation to officers in the armed forces who were risking their lives for king and country. The club provided every kind of luxury, entertainment, and facilities for pleasure. The use of the club was usually restricted to commissioned officers on leave in London from active service. A new member had to be introduced by a brother officer. My companion referred to it as the Glass Club. 1. Upon arrival, officer guests were interviewed by an official. If he was satisfied with their credentials, they were told how the club functioned. The officer applying for admission was asked to give his word of honor that he would not mention the names of any persons he met during his stay at the club, or reveal their identity after he left the club. Having given this solemn promise, it was explained to the guest that he would meet a number of women well known in the best of London's society. They all wore masks. The officer was asked not to try to identify any of the ladies. He was sworn to keep their secret should he happen to identify any of them accidentally. With the preliminaries over, the officer was shown to his private room. It was furnished in a most luxuriant manner. The furnishings included a huge double bed, dressing table, wardrobe, cabinet with wines and liqueurs, a smoking humidor, and private toilet and bath. The new guest was invited to make himself at home. He was informed that he would receive a lady visitor. She would wear a brooch of costume jewelry with the number of his room. If, after getting acquainted, he wished to take her down to dinner, that was his privilege. The reception room, where guests and their hostesses mingled over cocktails before dinner, was like that of a king's palace. The dining room was large enough to accommodate 50 couples. The ballroom was such that many people dream about but few seldom see. Costly decorations were set off by luxurious drapes, subdued lighting, beautiful women gorgeously dressed, soft dreamy music, the smell of rare perfumes, made the place an Arab's dream of heaven. The whole atmosphere of the club was such that the officers home on leave relaxed at first and then set out to have a real Roman holiday. There was nothing gross or vulgar about the Glass Club. Everything about the place was beautiful, delicate, soft, and pliant, the exact opposite of the horrors, the violence, the brutality, of a modern war. Between dance numbers, entertainers gave performances which brought out the feelings of joy, fun and laughter. As the evening progressed, a long buffet was literally loaded with luscious dishes of fish and game. A bar provided every kind of drink from champagne to straight whiskey. Between midnight and 1 a.m., 5 beautiful girls performed the dance of the 7 veils. The dance depicted a scene in a sultan's harem. The girls started the dance fully clothed, even to the veil they wore to conceal the facial features, but, when the dance ended, the girls were entirely naked. They danced the final act in their lithe nakedness, waving the flimsy veil around and about them in a manner which extenuated, rather than concealed, their physical charms. Couples, when tired of entertainment, dancing, and other people's company, retired to their private rooms. Next day they could enjoy indoor swimming, tennis, badminton, billiards, or, there was the card room, which was a miniature Monte Carlo. About November 1916, a very high personage was lured into visiting the club when he received a note saying that he would obtain information of the greatest importance to the British government. He drove to the club in his private car. He instructed his chauffeur to wait for him. After being admitted, he was taken to one of the luxuriously furnished bed-sitting rooms. A lady joined him. When she saw him, she nearly fainted. It was his own wife. She was much younger than her husband. She had been acting as hostess to lonely officers on leave for a considerable time. It was a most embarrassing situation. The wife knew nothing of the plot. She had no secret information to give. She was convinced that both she and her husband were philandering. She thought it was only this unfortunate chance meeting which had brought them face to face. There was a scene. The husband was informed regarding the part hostesses played at the club. But his lips were sealed as if in death. He was a member of the government. He couldn't afford to figure in a scandal. Every employee in the club, both male and female, was a spy. They reported everything that happened at the club to their masters. The identity of those involved became known. The information thus obtained was printed for the record in what became known as the Black Book. The Black Book recorded their sins of omission and commission, their peculiar vices, their special weaknesses, their financial status, the condition of their domestic relations, and the degree of affection they had for relatives and friends. Their connection with, and their influence over, influential men in politics, industry, and religion was carefully noted. In November 1916, a member of parliament tried to expose the real character of the Glass Club. 3 army officers, who had patronized the club, became suspicious that it was a vast espionage system, after an attempt had been made to blackmail them into giving information that would have been valuable to the enemy. Their adventure involved an Australian lady, her chauffeur, and the wives and daughters of several highly placed government officials. 2. The effort to make known the true facts was suppressed, but mention of the Black Book was made in Parliament and in the public press. The government's policy was said to be based on the contention that a scandal of such magnitude could prove a national calamity at a time when the armed forces at sea, on land, and in the air were meeting severe reverses. The liberal press began to attack the Prime Minister. He was accused of harboring men within his government who were unfit to hold office. He was accused of having had extensive dealings with German industrialists and financiers prior to the war. He was accused of being friendly towards the Kaiser. He was accused of being unable to make prompt and firm decisions. He was ridiculed as, wait-and-see Asquith. My companion told me that evidence against high officials involved in the Glass Club scandal caused the government to resign. Thus, according to my companion, the British Empire was forced to change political horses in the middle of a world war. When Mr. Asquith did resign in December 1916, he was superseded by a coalition government headed by David Lloyd George. Winston Churchill and Mr. Balfour were 2 of the more prominent members. In the middle of a world war that the British Empire fomented for control of the world's economy. A war that England declared on Germany thanks to the good offices of members of the Round Table Roberts, Curzon, Balfour, Lothian, and the Times, who considered Empire UK God's gift to planet Earth and couldn't suffer Germany, 2, to have a navy and colonies, and national industry and a railway to Baghdad, while Jewish money men of the city spoke up against entering into the war. Darny Goshi, how sad, somebody beat them in their own game. Shortly after hearing the above story, I was struck by the fact that the 3 army officers mentioned were reported in the official lists as killed in action. In wartime, such a thing is quite possible. Next came a brief notice that the Australian lady, and her chauffeur, had been imprisoned under the Defence of the Realm Act. Then came an announcement that the Member of Parliament involved in the case had retired from public life. A few weeks later, I was taken off duty as King's Messenger and appointed as navigating officer of British submarines. We did lose 33% of our officers and men, but I was one of those to survive. It was not until long after the war, when I was studying modern history and comparative religions, that I began to realize the vast importance of political Zionism to those who planned to obtain undisputed control of the world's economy. The following historical events speak for themselves. When war broke out in 1914, the RT. Hun. H.H. Asquith was Prime Minister. He was an anti-Zionist. The international bankers decided that Asquith's government had to go and be replaced by a coalition government in which David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill would wield great influence. Lloyd George had for years been solicitor for the Zionist movement as planned and financed by the Rothschilds. Winston Churchill had been a supporter of political Zionism from the time he first entered politics. In 1917, the international bankers were supporting both the Bolshevik and Zionist movements. It would seem incredible that the British cabinet didn't know what was going on, particularly when the British government had had to intervene to get Trotsky and his revolutionary leaders released after they had been detained in Halifax while on their way from New York to Russia. The overthrow of the Russian Empire was bound to cause the withdrawal of the mighty Russian armies from the war on the side of the Allied powers. The German armies, which had been engaged on the Eastern Front, would be free to reinforce the armies fighting against the Allied forces on the Western Front. Despite this knowledge, nothing was done to prevent the plans of the international financiers reaching maturity. The British government was aware of the serious conditions brewing in regard to Russia. This is proved by the fact that the matter was discussed by the cabinet and a decision was reached to send Lord Kitchener to Russia for the purpose of reorganizing the Russian military forces. Lord Kitchener sailed from Scapa Flow aboard the HMS Hampshire. She was mysteriously sunk during the night of June 5, 1916. Lord Kitchener was lost with all but a dozen of the crew. The survivors drifted ashore on a life raft. The British government announced HMS Hampshire was sunk by a German U-boat or a German mine. This has been proved to be a lie. I investigated this incident very thoroughly. In a previous book, Hell's Angels of the Deep, published in 1932, I proved HMS Hampshire had not been sunk by an enemy torpedo or mine. HMS Hampshire was sunk by either sabotage or due to an error of judgment on the part of her navigating officer. Judging all evidence available, I was convinced that HMS Hampshire sank after striking the submerged North Shoals rocks. It is hard to believe that a skilled and experienced naval navigator committed such an error of judgment. I still believe that a saboteur probably tampered with the magnets in the steering compass. Euro compasses were not then standard equipment, and even ships that had them found the Sperry models very unreliable, as I know from personal experience. General Erich von Ludendorff, who was chief of staff and shared with General Hindenburg the leadership of Germany's military might, also studied the circumstances surrounding the loss of HMS Hampshire and Lord Kitchener's death. He states positively, action by German naval units, either U-boats or mine layers, had nothing to do with the sinking of the ship. He said he had arrived at the conclusion that the death of Lord Kitchener was an act of God, because had he lived he would undoubtedly have reorganized the Russian armies and trained them into the most formidable fighting force. The general then remarked, had he done this, the Bolsheviks would have come into possession of one of the most formidable fighting machines the world has ever known. Such a force would have enabled communism to sweep over the whole world. I maintain that the international bankers could not afford to have the Russian armies organized until after the Menshevik uprising, and after Kerensky's provisional government had been overthrown in 1917. It is very doubtful if Lenin and Trotsky could have accomplished what they did if Lord Kitchener had been able to reorganize, discipline, and train the Russian armed forces in 1916. History also records that Winston Churchill and Lord Kitchener had quarreled seriously over military policy during 1914-1916. Lord Kitchener had bitterly opposed Churchill's idea of sending the naval division to Antwerp in 1914. He had also opposed Churchill's plan to capture the Dardanelles. Both ventures proved to be costly mistakes. The Dardanelles venture could have succeeded, and would probably have ended the war in 1916, if Churchill had waited until both army and naval forces were ready to cooperate jointly. When Churchill insisted that the naval forces attack the Dardanelles alone, he notified the enemy of intended strategy. After Churchill had committed the initial blunder, the army was ordered to participate. Lord Kitchener's objections were overruled. His advice was ignored. The Allied military forces committed to the assault on the Dardanelles were insufficient in numbers, improperly trained, poorly equipped for such a task, and badly supported both in regard to provisions, medical aid, and reinforcements. They were forced to attack first-class troops whose leaders had been alerted to their danger. The Allied military and naval forces were required to overcome military and naval obstacles that had not been in existence when Churchill ordered the first naval assault. The Dardanelles campaign was doomed to failure from the start. The more we study the methods employed by the secret powers behind international affairs, the more obvious it is to see that they make private assassinations look like accidents or suicides, sabotage look like carelessness, errors of judgment, and unintentional blunders committed due to excusable circumstances. The only possible consideration that could justify the policy of the coalition government in 1916, in regard to Russia, was the fact that the government knew they could not obtain financial backing, or military aid from America until after the Russian government had been overthrown. Such a statement seems preposterous, but it is supported by the following facts. The Mensheviks started the Russian Revolution February 1917. The Tsar abdicated March 15, 1917. Jacob H. Schiff, senior partner of Kuhn Loeb and Company of New York, immediately removed the restrictions he had imposed extending financial aid to the Allies. Mortimer Schiff was then ordered by his father Jacob to cable Sir Ernest Cassels, because of recent action in Germany and developments in Russia we shall no longer abstain from Allied government financing. On April 5 the British government announced that it was sending R.T. Hun. Arthur James Balfour, the Foreign Secretary, to the United States, to notify the American bankers that the British government was prepared to officially endorse their plans for political Zionism provided they would bring America into the war on the side of the Allies. America came into the war. On June 7, 1917, the first American troops landed in France. On July 18, 1917 Lord Rothschild wrote Mr. Balfour as follows. Dear Mr. Balfour, at last I am able to send you the formula you asked for. If His Majesty's government will send me a message in line with this formula, and they and you approve it, I will hand it to the Zionist Federation at a meeting to be called for that purpose. The draft declaration was as follows. 1. His Majesty's government accepts the principle that Palestine should be reconstituted as a national home for the Jewish people. 3. His Majesty's government will use its best endeavors to secure the achievement of this object, and will discuss the necessary methods and means with the Zionist organization. 4. Mr. Balfour, and the British government, agreed to the terms dictated by Lord Rothschild and his Zionist confreres. This is proved by the fact that on August 28, Sir Herbert Samuel, he was subsequently made a Viscount, Sir Alfred Mond, he was subsequently made a Lord, and Lord Rothschild persuaded the British cabinet to send Lord Reading to the USA as head of the economic mission. Lord Reading, when Sir Rufus Isaacs, had been mixed up in the Marconi scandal. The details of the deal he negotiated with the USA government in September 1917 have never been made known. It is known, however, that the deal had to do with the Bank of England because it was completely reorganized, under American supervision, and physically rebuilt after 1919. 5. In September, Jacob Schiff of Kuhn Loeb and Company wrote a long letter dealing with the Zionist question to a Mr. Friedman. In it the following passages occur. I do believe that it might be feasible to secure the goodwill of America, Great Britain and France, 6. In any event, towards the promotion of a large influx, and settlement of our people in Palestine. Further, it might be possible to obtain from the powers the formal assurance to our people that they shall obtain autonomy in Palestine as soon as their numbers become large enough to justify this. September 26, 1917, Louis Marshall, legal representative of Kuhn Loeb and Company wrote his friend Max Sr., another leading Zionist, as follows. Major Lionel de Rothschild, of the League for British Jews, informs me that his organization is in agreement with the American Jewish Committee. The Balfour Declaration, with its acceptance by the powers, is an act of the highest diplomacy. Zionism is but an incident of a far-reaching plan, it is merely a convenient peg on which to hang a powerful weapon. All protests that the opponents may make would be futile. It would subject them individually to hateful and concrete examples of a most impressive nature. I would shrink from the possibilities which might result. Here we have a blunt admission from Louis Marshall, that, Zionism is but an incident of a far-reaching plan, it is merely a convenient peg on which to hang a powerful weapon. The far-reaching plan referred to cannot be anything else than the long-range plan to which continual reference has already been made. It is a plan by which the international financiers intend to win ultimate undisputed control of the wealth, natural resources, and manpower of the entire world. A few of the more important historical events which bear out the above statement are as follows. On January 28, 1915, Mr. Asquith, Prime Minister of England wrote in his diary, I just received from Herbert Samuel a memorandum headed The Future of Palestine. He thinks we might plant in this territory about 3 or 4 million European Jews. It read almost like a new edition of Tancred brought up to date. I confess I am not attracted by this proposed addition to our responsibilities, etc. Thus Asquith proved himself anti-Zionist. Prominent Zionists owned most, if not all, of Britain's major war industries. For no good reason, in 1915-1916, Britain suddenly found herself short of chemicals needed in the manufacturing of explosives. Guns and munitions which had been promised our Russian allies failed to materialize. Shells for our guns were so scarce they had to be rationed. The Asquith government was accused of bungling the war effort. But let us examine the facts. Yes, sir, examine the facts. Why was England in that war when Germany did not want war with the United Kingdom, and had it known that the British Empire will join the war on the side of France, Germany would not have mobilized? Why had England not declared its intention before August 1914? Why did Foreign Minister Ed Grey and Ambassador to Russia Paul Eolog do everything they could not to avoid armed conflict? Sir Frederick Nathan was in charge of chemical production. Messrs. Brunner and Mond were credited with doing all they could to correct the critical situation which had arisen. Using government funds they constructed a large chemical factory at Silveltown. Sir Alfred Mond was appointed His Majesty's Commissioner of Works. He afterwards became head of the Jewish Agency in Palestine. Work on the factory was rushed ahead. The factory was brought into production in record time. Bouquets were passed around and honors bestowed upon the wealthy Zionist financiers who were supposedly doing so much for the British war effort. But as soon as the Silvertown factory came into production, it blew up with the loss of 40 lives. Over 800 buildings and homes were demolished. 7. Because of the failure of Britain to deliver arms and munitions to Russia as promised, severe military reverses were experienced on the Eastern Front. Newspapers reported Russian troops were fighting with sticks and bare fists until slaughtered by well-armed German troops. A letter written by Professor Bernard Parez, Professor Parez was knighted afterwards, to Lloyd George would indicate that the guns and munitions promised the Imperial Russian government were deliberately withheld to create conditions favorable for the revolution then being planned in Geneva and New York by the international bankers. Professor Parez's letter, written in 1915, reads in part: the same questions for Russia. Why did it launch that suicide attack on Germany when everyone knew that Russia won't be ready for war at least until 1917? Was Russia in that war because of the Freemasons, because of German threat, or because of the idea of the Slav historic mission and England's dangling in front of it the carrot of controlling the Bosporus which, until then, England opposed? I have to submit my strong opinion that the unfortunate failure of Messrs. Vickers Maxim and Company to supply Russia with munitions which were to have reached the country 5 months ago, is gravely jeopardizing the relations of the two countries, and in particular their cooperation in the work of the present war. I am definitely told that so far no supplies would ever have reached Russia from England. David Lloyd George, at the time the letter was written, was Chancellor of the Exchequer and responsible for financing the war. Messrs. Vickers Maxim and Company were controlled by Sir Ernest Cassell's business associate of Kuhn Loeb and Company of New York, who in turn, were affiliated with the Rothschilds, and the international bankers of England, France, Germany, etc. When Professor Parez's letter was discussed by the cabinet, Lloyd George is alleged to have defended the government's policy by saying, charity should start at home. Our British soldiers fighting in France have only got 4 machine guns to a battalion. They should be better armed before we export arms to Russia. Lord Kitchener is reported to have replied, I consider more than 4 machine guns per battalion a luxury when our failure to deliver the arms we promised to Russia has resulted in the Russians having only 1 rifle available for every 6 men. The agents of the international conspirators were ordered to smear Lord Kitchener, and they circulated the story all over the world that Lord Kitchener had stated he considered more than 4 machine guns to a battalion of British soldiers, fighting in France, a luxury. This smear and untruth has continued to this very day. It appeared in the biography of David Lloyd George recently published. It appeared in a review of the biography which appeared recently in the Toronto Star Weekly. I sent the editor of the Star Weekly the truth regarding this important historical event. He replied it was too much dynamite for him to handle. He informed me he had handed my correspondence to the Daily Star. Needless to say, the truth was never published. This is a typical illustration of how the international conspirators smear the reputations of honest men, even dead men, in order to cover up their own wrongdoing. It illustrates perfectly how their agents use the press of the world to misinform the public so they will blame innocent men, and even their own governments, for the harm done as the result of their machinations. To prove that Vickers Maxim and Company were under the influence of Kuhn Loeb and Company at this time, Boris Brassalt says, on February 4, 1916, the Russian Revolutionary Party of America held a meeting in New York which was attended by 62 delegates. It was revealed that secret reports had just reached the party from Russia designating the moment as favorable. The assembly was assured that ample funds would be furnished by persons in sympathy with the liberating of the people of Russia. In this connection, the name of Jacob Schiff was repeatedly mentioned. 8. Jacob Schiff was at that time senior member of Kuhn Loeb and Company of New York. Approximately 50 of the 62 people attending the meeting on February 4, 1916 were men who had taken an active part in the Russian Revolution in 1905. Once again they were to be used to foment revolutionary action, but Jacob Schiff had planned that the fruits of victory were to be usurped by Lenin, in the interests of the international bankers. The Encyclopedia of Jewish Knowledge says of Zionism, the World War forced the abandonment of Berlin as the center of the organization and all authority was transferred to the Provisional Zionist Emergency Committee established in New York under the leadership of Justice L.D. Brandeis. Jacob de Haas, writing in his book, Louis Dembitz Brandeis, says, the Zionist Transfer Department, its ramifications extended through all the war zones occupied by the Allies, and throughout Turkey, Syria, Palestine, to Transjordan and Baghdad, practically not a cent of the millions handled was lost. Starting by using the good offices of the USA Department of State Foreign Office as a means of communication and deposit, it became so successful, and so reliable, it was employed by the Treasury of the USA to deliver monies and messages, which the government could not handle successfully. Embassies in European capitals advanced cash on the requisition of the Zionist executive secretary in New York. L. Fry has this to say in Waters Flowing Eastward, p. 51. From then on their influence was felt more and more in political circles in Europe and America. In particular, the Zionist Transfer Department, as it was called, was in a position to transmit funds and information to subversive elements in enemy countries. Next we find the Grand Orient Lodges back into the picture of the WRM again. M. Erzberger says on pp. 145 to 146 of My Experience in the World War, on March 16, 1916, the Alliance Israelite paid the Grand Orient of Paris the sum of 700,000 francs, and in the archives of the Grand Orient of Rome it can be proved that on March 18, 1916 the transfer of 1 million lire to the Grand Orient of Rome took place. I am not so naive as to imagine that the Alliance Israelite makes use of 2 Grand Orients solely for the purpose of sending 1 million lire to Italian Jews. Telling of events after Asquith had been deposed in 1916, A.N. Field says in All These Things, p. 104, Jewish influence in British politics became pronounced after the rise of Mr. Lloyd George. L. Fry on page 55 of Water Flowing Eastward, says, the first official London meeting of the political committee took place on February 7, 1917, in a house of Dr. Moses Gaster. There were present Lord Rothschild, James de Rothschild, son of Edmund de Rothschild of Paris, former owner of the Rothschild colonies in Palestine, Sir Mark Sykes, whose house in Buckingham Gates was fully equipped as headquarters for the Zionist cause with telegraphic apparatus, etc., Sir Herbert Samuel, Herbert Bentwich, later Attorney General for Palestine, Harry Socker, Joseph Cowen, Chaim Weizmann, and Nahum Sokolov. 9. The Zionist program to serve as a basis for official negotiations covering the future mandates of Palestine, Armenia, Mesopotamia, and the Kingdom of the Hejaz was discussed in detail. JMN. Jeffries Opsit. Page 139 contributes this further information. The minutes of this meeting were communicated forthwith in cipher to the Zionist Organization of the United States. From now on, the political Zionist organization in the United States began to take a hand in the shaping of British policy and the ordering of British affairs. To illustrate the power the international bankers exercise over the British government's affairs, Samuel Landman is quoted. 10. He says, after an agreement had been arrived at between Sir Mark Sykes, Weizmann, and Sokolov, it was resolved to send a secret message to Justice Brandeis that the British cabinet would help the Jews to gain Palestine in return for active Jewish sympathy, and for support in the USA for the Allied cause so as to bring about a radical pro-Ally tendency in the United States. This message was sent in cipher through the British Foreign Office. Secret messages were also sent to the Zionist leaders in Russia through General MacDonough. Dr. Weizmann, one of the founders of political Zionism, was able to secure from the government the service of half a dozen younger Zionists for active work on behalf of Zionism. At that time conscription was in force, and only those engaged in work of national importance could be released from active service at the front. I remember Drive. Weizmann writing a letter to General McDonough, Director of Military Operations, and invoking his assistance in obtaining the exemption from active service of Leon Simon, Harry Socker, Simon Marks, Hyamson, Tolkowski and myself. At Drive, Weizmann's request I was transferred from the War Office MI9 to the Ministry of Propaganda, and later to the Zionist Office, about December 1916. From that time onwards, for several years, Zionism was considered an ally of the British government. Passport and travel difficulties did not exist when a man was recommended by our office. For instance, a certificate signed by me was accepted by the Home Office that an Ottoman Jew was to be treated as a friendly alien and not as an enemy, which was the case of Turkish subjects. Study of the life of Disraeli reveals that he spent many Sunday evenings with the Rothschilds of London. It is revealed that while Kuhn Loeb and Company of New York were financing the Jewish revolutionaries in Russia, the London Rothschilds were the managers of the Tsarist administration in London. We also learned that the London Rothschilds were liberals and that from 1840 to 1917 the liberal press controlled by the Rothschilds was consistently anti-Russian. Disraeli informs us that in Germany the head men in politics and finance were considered reactionaries because they didn't allow the international bankers to do exactly as they wanted to do. Baron von Bleichroeder of Berlin and the Warburgs of Hamburg were the Rothschild representatives in Germany. In Russia the Weinsteins of Odessa assisted the Ginsburgs in St. Petersburg to look after the Rothschild interests. Another man who was very active on the part of the international bankers was Otto Kahn. He cleverly hid his true colors, as a world revolutionary, behind the national flags of the several countries in which he lived and pretended to be a patriotic citizen. Mr. Otto Kahn was born in Germany. He migrated to the United States the same as Paul Warburg did. Like Warburg, he also became a partner in Kuhn Loeb and Company. Kahn, upon arriving in America, obtained employment as a clerk with Speyer and Company so as not to make matters too obvious. He later on married the granddaughter of Mr. Wolf, one of the founders of Kuhn Loeb and Company. When Mrs. Kahn visited Moscow in 1931, she was officially received by the Soviet government, which gave a grand dinner and several brilliant receptions in her honor. The Red Armies of Stalin lined the roads as she passed along, and the soldiers presented arms as she passed by. 11. On April 2, 1934, an article appeared in the Daily Herald in which Mr. Hanan Swaffer wrote, "I knew Otto Kahn, the multimillionaire, for many years. I knew him when he was a patriotic German. I knew him when he was a patriotic American. Naturally, when he wanted to enter the British House of Commons, he joined the Patriotic Party. Mr. Otto Kahn would have become president of the English-speaking Union if his revolutionary activities had not been accidentally exposed when it was proved that his house was the meeting place for Soviet agents such as Nina Smorodin, Claire Sheridan, Louise Bryant, and Margaret Harrison. In the summer of 1917, the problem of who was to finance Lenin and Trotsky during their joint revolutionary effort in Russia had to be solved. The international bankers decided that their representatives would meet in Stockholm, Sweden, because that country was neutral, and comparatively free from international spies. Among those attending the meeting were men representing the banking interests in Britain, Germany, France, Russia, and the United States of America. Mr. Protopopov, the Russian Minister of the Interior, was there, and so was Mr. Warburg of Hamburg. He was the brother of Paul Warburg, who was a partner in the Kuhn Loeb and Company of New York, who had drafted the legislation for the Federal Reserve System in 1910. It will be seen that in order to decide how finances should be arranged for Lenin and Trotsky to overthrow the Russian government, delegates attended from all warring nations. It was finally decided that Kuhn Loeb of New York should place $50 million to the credit of Lenin and Trotsky in the Bank of Sweden. Both British and American intelligence officers reported these facts to their respective governments in 1917. Commander E.N. Cromie died fighting off a revolutionary mob which attacked the British consulate in St. Petersburg. He held them off in order to give his confreres time to burn documents relating to this and other matters. 12. The American government forwarded to the British government reports they had received from their intelligence officers. Mr. Oudendijk, the Netherlands minister in Petrograd, who looked after the British interests in Russia after Commander Cromie was murdered, also warned the British government. His warning was published in April 1919 as part of a white paper on the Bolshevik Revolution published by the King's printer. The plans Jacob Schiff had made to allow Trotsky, and his band of revolutionary leaders, to return to St. Petersburg from New York went away when Trotsky was detained by Canadian government officials in Halifax, Nova Scotia, while en route. The power the international bankers exercise over constitutional governments is fully illustrated by the fact that immediately they protested to the governments concerned, Trotsky and his whole gang of revolutionary gangsters were released and given safe conduct through the British blockade zone. Further proof of the British politicians' complicity in the Russian Revolution of 1917 was obtained by D. Petrovsky, who explains the part played by Sir G. Buchanan, the ambassador. 13. Petrovsky proves that, although fully informed of all that was going on behind the scenes, Lloyd George's government aided the international bankers to put Trotsky and his revolutionary leaders into Russia, while at the same time the German High Command aided the international bankers to get Lenin and his gang of revolutionary leaders from Switzerland to Petrograd. Lenin and his followers were provided with a private railway coach for their journey across Germany. Mr. Petrovsky reveals that Milyukov, who had been appointed Minister for Foreign Affairs by the Russian Republican government in the spring of 1917, was the man who negotiated this intrigue which involved both warring nations. It is also recorded that in appreciation for the cooperation given by the German General Staff, the government of Great Britain agreed to Milyukov's request that M.M. Litvinov be released. He had been arrested by British intelligence officers as a spy for Germany. The identification of M.M. Litvinov proves of great interest. He was born to parents whose name was Finkelstein. When he joined the World Revolutionary Movement, he changed his name to Meyer Wallach. When he was closely associated with Lenin and his Bolshevik party, he changed his name once again to Maxim Litvinov. He is the same man referred to as Litvinov the German spy, and he is the same man who had been arrested while trying to cash the 500-ruble notes Stalin had obtained when he bombed, and robbed, the Tiflis Bank. Following his release by the British authorities, Litvinov returned to Russia. He aided Lenin to overthrow the Kerensky Provisional Government, and the Menshevik Soviet established in St. Petersburg prior to October 1917. Litvinov was Stalin's commissar for foreign affairs from 1930 to 1939. He was appointed a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party in 1935. His ability as an assassin, receiver of stolen money, spy, international gangster, and leader of revolutionary efforts in several countries was acclaimed by the nations of the world when he was appointed President of the Council of the United Nations. Only an international group, such as the international bankers, could have saved this man's life, and assured him his liberty when he was carrying out the criminal aspects of international intrigue. Only the power and influence of the international bankers could have caused him to be elected President of the United Nations Council. This illustrates the fact that the Illuminati control those who control the United Nations. Other evidence is available to prove that the international bankers of the United Kingdom, the United States, Germany and Russia worked together even after Germany and Britain were at war. It is contained in a pamphlet entitled Trotsky Defender Publishers, Wichita, Kansas, which quotes a letter written by J.M. Dell to Lloyd George, personally. But why go on? It would take volumes to quote all the evidence to prove that the international bankers organized, financed, and directed the Russian Revolution in order to obtain control of a vast territory so that the Illuminati could try out their ideas for totalitarianism. Only by experimenting in an area as vast as the so-called USSR's could they find out mistakes and weaknesses by the process of trial and error. Until they had performed this experiment, which cost millions and millions of human lives, it would have been gross stupidity on their part to try to rule the whole world. Theirs has been a long-range plan. It started 3,000 years ago. It was revised at the meeting in Bauer's goldsmith shop in Frankfurt in 1773. Unless united action is taken, it is likely to end when they take over economical and political control after World War III. It will thus be seen that the coalition government which took over the prosecution of the war from Prime Minister Asquith, in December 1916, made no effort to stop the international bankers from proceeding with their plans for the Russian Revolution, even when they knew its success would cause the Russian armies to be withdrawn from the war. Proof that the Zionists in both Britain and the USA agreed that the Russian imperial government should be overthrown, is to be found in the fact that immediately Lenin announced he had established his dictatorship in November 1917, Lloyd George also announced that the policy of the British government would be to back the Rothschild plan for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This proves Lloyd George held no resentment towards the international bankers for taking Russia out of the war as an ally of Britain. The Jewish-dominated Menshevik revolutionaries in Russia had fought the abortive revolution in 1905. They also started the revolution in February 1917. Once again they met with great success during the first stages of the revolutionary effort. They actually established a Soviet in Petrograd. The international bankers didn't mind who carried the ball until it was near the goal, but as soon as the ball carrier got into position to score they stepped in and took over the play. Their goal was to bring about a totalitarian dictatorship operated on the joint stock company principle. Lenin was made dictator. They remained behind the scene. The communist mob was blamed for their crimes against humanity. On July 17, 1917, the Bolsheviks under Lenin started an anti-government agitation in Russia. This resulted in an uprising by thousands of the city's inflamed worker-soldier population. This abortive revolt is known as the July Days. Kerensky dealt with the situation firmly. The mobs were fired upon, several hundred people were killed, but order was restored. The Bolshevik leaders fled. Some were arrested. Lenin and Zinoviev hid in Sestroretsk. Trotsky, Kamenev, and Lunarcharsky were amongst those arrested. Stalin, who was at that time editor of Pravda, was not molested. After the revolt, Prince Lvov resigned and Kerensky, the Jewish Napoleon, became prime minister. Kerensky was a great orator. He tried to whip up enthusiasm for the war effort amongst the soldiers and workers. All Kerensky's oral efforts failed. Kerensky's influence began to decline steadily. Lenin was busy. He called for the 6th Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party to be held August 8 to 16. He came out of it leader of the unified revolutionary groups. Within a year the United Revolutionary Party called itself the Communist Party. At the Congress a secret committee was formed called the October Central Committee. It consisted of 26 members who were to plan the October Revolution and then direct the revolutionary effort in all its various phases. Stalin made the grade at last. He was elected to the Presidium of the 6th Party Congress. The majority of students believe Stalin wouldn't even have been given notice if many of the other experienced revolutionary leaders hadn't been in jail, but the truth is, Lenin was acting as chief agent for the secret powers. They had plans to use Stalin to supersede others. The idea of the Central Committee to organize the October Revolution was to anticipate the provisional government's intention to call a general election in which the secret ballot would be used to elect a representative constitutional government to rule the Russian Empire. Lenin felt that if his bid for power was to succeed he had to make it before the Constitutional Assembly met in January to arrange the nationwide election. If this election was ever held the people would have their own representatives in the government. He felt it would be harder to get the support necessary to overthrow a people's government than it would to overthrow the provisional government. In this he proved right. Strange as it may seem, in the light of future events, Kamenev was released from prison August 17, and Trotsky exactly a month later. By September 24, Trotsky was elected president of the Petersburg Soviet in place of Chaidze. On September 26, the Petersburg Soviet voted to transfer all military power to a military revolutionary committee under the leadership of Trotsky. The real Lenin Revolution was by now only a few days away. Lenin was proving what proper planning and timetable precision, backed by unlimited financial aid, could accomplish. He knew how to use the element of surprise advantageously. He rapidly convinced many leaders of other revolutionary groups that he was the man to direct the revolutionary war. He soon had everyone under discipline. The leaders were required to obey orders efficiently, and without question, or else. The revolutionary leaders circulated an order that the Second All-Russian Congress of the Soviets would meet November 7. This was a red herring drawn across the trail to make the general public believe that no revolutionary action was pending in the immediate future. On November 4, however, the Military Revolutionary Committee arranged huge mass meetings preparatory for the actual revolt. The next day, November 5, the garrison of Peter and Paul declared itself in alliance with the Bolsheviks. On November 6, Kerensky made a desperate effort to forestall the revolution by ordering the arrest of the Military Revolutionary Committee. He banned all Bolshevik publications. He ordered fresh troops to replace the garrison of Peter and Paul. But Lenin had organized his fifth column too well. Kerensky's orders were never carried out. Officials he trusted let him down. Lenin sneaked out of hiding. He joined the Military Revolutionary Committee in Smolny Institute as soon as he knew Kerensky's counter-revolutionary measures had failed. The institute served as the revolutionary headquarters. At 2 a.m., November 7, the order to begin the organized revolutionary effort was given. By noon, St. Petersburg was largely in Lenin's hands. At 3 p.m. he delivered a fiery speech to the Petersburg Soviet. By 9:00 p.m., Bolshevik troops were besieging the Winter Palace headquarters of the Provisional Government. At 11 p.m. the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets met and the Bolsheviks had a clear majority. The Congress thus became the official government of Russia. Kamenev was elected the first president. Lenin became premier. Trotsky became Commissar of Foreign Affairs. On November 21, a Jew by the name of Sverdlov succeeded Kamenev. He had been in the Bolshevik Party only 6 months and was considered a very minor figure, but, after being elected president, he quickly assumed absolute control of the Russian economy. He was a specially trained financial expert and agent of the bankers. After they established control, Lenin and the communists outlawed gold as money, closed down private banks and issued interest-free, government-backed paper currency. Many things happen in revolutionary circles which never come to light. Sverdlov died, a very young man, only 2 years after he reorganized the Russian internal economy. He had served his purpose. He knew too much, so he died. Thus history repeats itself. Bloody battles, which might better be described as wholesale massacres, and the ruthlessly conducted reign of terror, proved the theory that utter ruthlessness and organized terror, in which physical sufferings are combined with mental anguish and moral degradation, have definite economic value, because the Bolsheviks obtained undisputed control of Petersburg within a few days. Lenin didn't allow success to go to his head. The Russian Empire was large. He craftily allowed the elections, for which the provisional government had set up the machinery, to be held on November 25. The provisional government had planned that the convocation of the Assembly of freely elected representatives should be organized by a special commission. Lenin let everything go according to schedule and then he arrested the members of this special commission. He substituted for it a commissary for the Constitutional Assembly. The only difference between the one and the other was that Bolsheviks headed by Uritsky dominated the one Lenin had formed. By this move the Bolsheviks were in a position to exert authority over the newly elected assembly as soon as it convened. When the assembly did finally convene, Sverdlov took charge of the proceedings although he was not a delegate. The Bolsheviks resorted to tactics which kept the delegates in a constant uproar. They created utter confusion. After 10 hours the Bolsheviks all walked out suddenly. Bolshevik troops walked in. They ejected the remaining delegates and locked the doors of the building. This was the end of constitutional rule in Russia. In March 1918, the Bolsheviks, who called themselves the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, moved to Moscow and changed their name to the Communist Party. The Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets now became the official governing body. The Jewish-led Social Revolutionary Party did not want Lenin as number one man in Russia. On August 30, 1918, 2 Jewish members of this group tried to assassinate him. Lenin was wounded and Uritsky, whom Lenin had appointed head of his Cheka organization, was killed. This incident gave Lenin the excuse for pulling out all stops. He turned on terrorism at full blast. Night raids became regular occurrences. No person knew, when he went to bed, if he would be alive in the morning. David Shub in his pro-Marxist book, Lenin, says, little time was wasted sifting evidence, or classifying people rounded up, in these night raids. The prisoners were generally hustled to the old police station, near the Winter Palace and shot. Murder, torture, mutilation, rape, burning, these and all other outrages against human sentiment and decency, were the impregnable rocks upon which the so-called Soviet Socialist Republic was founded. Millions of Russian citizens died. It is estimated that more than 12 million others were condemned to serve the state at forced labor until they were released by death. And while the Allies were half-heartedly fighting Bolshevism on 4 fronts, Lenin reorganized the WRM. In March 1919, he convened the Third International. He presided. Zinoviev was elected president. The purpose of the meeting was to consolidate the revolutionary parties in every country in the world, and to arrange to provide the leaders with advice, financial aid, and any other assistance considered necessary to the success of popular world revolution. 14. One an exact duplicate of this club was organized just outside Montreal during World War II. 2. This was in keeping with paragraph 8 of the plot exposed in Chapter 3. 3. Note the word used is Palestine, not Israel. 4. This letter was quoted by Mr. Stokes, MP in the British Parliament during the Palestine debate December 11, 1947. 5. Read, Programme for the Third World War, by C.H. Douglas, Liverpool, 1944. 6. Mr. Cambon of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs accepted the Balfour Declaration in regard to supporting Zionism at this time. 7. For further details of this aspect of the war, read The Brief for the Prosecution, by C.H. Douglas. 8. Boris Brazel was author of World at the Crossroads, cp. 69. 9. This is the Sokolov who afterwards wrote History of Zionism. 10. He wrote World Jewry, London, February 22, 1936. It will be seen that a very similar situation was created by international intrigue at the beginning of World War II. 11. Read All These Things, A.N. Field. 12. Comder. Cromie served in British submarines at the same time as the author. His exploits on behalf of the Russians are recorded in By Guess and by God, a book published by the author in 1931. 13. Read La Russie sous les Juifs, pp. 20-28 and 34-35. 14. A great deal more information on the Russian angle can be obtained by reading Behind Communism, by Frank Britton.